What happens when the symbol of wartime graced the woman who once inspired Winston Churchill? Hollywood studios. And millions of Americans is called a washed-up has-been by her own husband. Just outside a studio dressing room, when Richard Ney, barely 30 years old, kicked down the door where Greer Garson sat quietly recovering from a serious back injury. What shattered wasn't just wood and hinges. What splintered in that moment was the illusion that a lifetime of elegance, discipline, and moral stature could protect someone from the raw cruelty of fading fame and private betrayal. And that leads us to the real question. What is left when your Oscar burns? Your body fails, and even your dignity isn't enough to stop people from turning away? Hello everyone, and welcome back to Tragedy Uncovered, the channel where we don't just look at the stars, but at the shadows they cast when the spotlight dies. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We uncover the forgotten truths behind fame, fortune, and the people history tried to silence, not with scandal, but with silence. Today, we're opening the long-shut case of Greer Garson. And yes, that name might bring a warm memory if you lived through the war years. To the world, she was the poised face of British courage, the ever-noble Mrs. Miniver. But behind closed doors, her life spiraled into a cocktail of physical agony, career sabotage, and a marriage that turned violent emotionally and literally. To understand why she mattered, and how she was lost, we have to peel back layers that go beyond film reels and press photos. Because this story, her story, is not just about a woman in a burned gown or a fractured spine. It's about the quiet way Hollywood eats its saints. Greer Garson wasn't supposed to be a star. Born in London in 1900, for those she would later claim Belfast. 1908, she constructed her own mythology with care, like so many women had to do to be taken seriously in a system built for men. But she didn't storm into Hollywood. She arrived late by industry standards, in her mid-30s, when most actresses were already being gently told to make way for the next ingenue. What she had wasn't youth. It was presence, dignity, a kind of commanding sweetness that could steady a nation's nerves during wartime, and did. Her performance in Mrs. Miniver wasn't just good. It was strategic. MGM understood exactly what it was doing when it cast her as the calm, practical mother holding her family together during air raids. Audiences, especially in America, newly entering World War II, saw in her something like moral reassurance, something that suggested civilization might just survive. Winston Churchill said the film had done more for the Allied war effort than a fleet of destroyers. President Roosevelt screened it at the White House. Queen Elizabeth told Garson her performance made the nation feel braver than we actually were. That's not just acting. That's diplomacy in a dress. And for a moment, it looked like that strength, that iron-laced elegance might protect her forever. But as we know too well on this channel, Hollywood gives, and Hollywood forgets. The same press that once called her the embodiment of womanhood would later gawk as her marriage crumbled in court. The same studio that paid her the highest salary for any newcomer would eventually struggle to find films where she still fit. What changed? Some would say the war ended. The world wanted different heroes. Others would argue that Greer never evolved beyond her own carefully maintained image, too dignified, too proper, too dull. But these are the same critiques levied against women who refuse to fall apart for public amusement. What they really meant was, she didn't beg to stay relevant. By the time her Oscar was destroyed in a house fire in the 1980s, no one seemed to remember that her performance in Mrs. Miniver was once considered vital to national morale. The Academy sent her a replacement statue, a symbolic gesture, and perhaps unintentionally, a metaphor for her whole career, polished, respectful, but not the original. And while most people think of her as the gentle war mother and floral prince, few remember the physical damage she carried for decades. A near-fatal injury while filming on location left her with a fractured spine. Years later, another wave quite literally would slam her against rocks during the shoot for Desire Me, reactivating that same injury and pushing her into what today we'd call PTSD. Back then, it was called being difficult. She kept showing up. She always kept showing up. Until showing up wasn't enough. That brings us back to that shattered door in 1946 and the husband on the other side. Richard Ney, 12 years her junior, once played her son on screen. When they married, many rolled their eyes. He made her feel younger, she told reporters. But what she didn't say, at least not out loud, was that she might have also been trying to outpace a system that treats aging actresses like furniture no longer in style. It didn't work. By the end of that violent holiday season, her back was in agony. Her film was a disaster, and her marriage had exploded. The courtroom testimony was heartbreaking. Garson described Ney mocking her, shouting that her career was finished. And perhaps he was right, not because she lacked talent, but because she no longer fit what the audience thought it wanted. When we remember Greer Garson today, it's often in soft focus, an icon of class, pressed into history books as one of MGM's wartime angels. But look closely, and what you'll find is a woman who suffered silently, who was discarded not for failure, but for growing older with grace. And that is a far more brutal truth than anything printed in the tabloids. In the next part of this video, we'll trace the rise that came before the fall. Because Greer Garson didn't just land in Hollywood, she out-negotiated Louis B. Mayer at their first dinner. She arrived not as a girl seeking fame, but as a woman demanding her worth. We'll uncover how the system built her, used her, and quietly erased her, and how that same system continues to do the same to women today. Until then, let me know in the comments, do you think dignity has a place in today's fame economy? Or is self-preservation a losing game in the face of entertainment's constant churn? And don't forget to subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered, where we don't flinch from the stories others prefer to leave in the dark. Before the door was shattered, before the Oscar burned, and before the pain of irrelevance crept in, there was a woman who stared down an industry with quiet defiance, not because she wanted to be worshipped, but because she refused to be dismissed. Greer Garson's rise to fame was not meteoric. It was stubborn, deliberate, built not on scandals or seduction, but on intellect and endurance, two things the film industry has always known how to exploit, but never how to reward. She was already 33 when she signed her first film contract with MGM, an age by which most actresses of the 1930s were being told to take secondary roles or play mothers. But Garson didn't arrive in Hollywood like a starlet. She arrived like a storm no one expected. Louis B. Mayer, the iron-fisted mogul who ran MGM like a kingdom, spotted her during a performance in London and extended an invitation not only to her, but to her mother. That's right. Even at the start of her career, Greer Garson traveled with her mother at her side, a detail that would later become a point of tension in her marriage, but also a symbol of her self-containment. She was never just another pretty face with a suitcase. She was a household unto herself. What's extraordinary is that during that first meeting, when most aspiring actresses would have begged for a screen test, Garson negotiated her salary. She asked for $500 per week, an unheard of figure at the time, especially for someone who had never appeared in a Hollywood film. And Mayer, recognizing that she wouldn't be controlled easily, gave it to her, not because she was compliant, but because she wasn't. But once she arrived in Hollywood, the machine didn't quite know what to do with her. MGM had its ingenues, its bombshells, its ice queens. Garson didn't fit any of the existing molds. She wasn't sultry like Hedy Lamarr. She wasn't dangerous like Joan Crawford. She was something rarer, a woman who knew who she was before they ever rolled the cameras. And yet, for months, she was shelved, paid, Pampered, but unused, Garson sat in a 5-room Beverly Hills mansion, waiting for a role. Her contract was secure, but her presence was idle. She was a product in the storeroom, not yet packaged, not yet sold. What finally changed everything was a supporting role in a film that didn't promise much. Goodbye, Mr. Chips. Her character Catherine appears briefly, then dies. Not exactly the kind of role that screams breakout success. But Garson infused that short performance with so much warmth, intelligence, and charm that audiences remembered her long after the film ended. Critics noticed. The Academy noticed. She earned her first Oscar nomination for a role that lasted barely half the movie. And just like that, a new kind of star was born, one that didn't fit the template, but shattered it entirely. In the wake of Goodbye, Mr. Chips, MGM understood what it had on its hands. Garson wasn't flashy, but she radiated something even more valuable in wartime America: moral certainty. She felt safe. She felt trustworthy. And so began her transformation into the cinematic emblem of strength, grace, and refined femininity, a new queen of the studio, poised perfectly between nobility and accessibility. And then came Mrs. Miniver, the film that would immortalize her, define her, and eventually trap her. On paper, Mrs. Miniver wasn't revolutionary. It was a war-era domestic drama, portraying a British housewife keeping her family together during the Blitz. But in Garson's hands, the role became something mythic. She didn't just play courage. She embodied it. At a time when bombs were literally falling over London, she gave American audiences a version of British resolve that was both human and heroic. The film premiered in 1942. By then, America had entered World War II, and the public appetite for strength wrapped in silk was insatiable. Mrs. Miniver was a sensation. It won 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actress for Garson herself. And her speech? It went down in history not for what it said, but for how long it lasted. 5.5 minutes. That's right. Her gratitude overflowed so generously that the Academy rewrote its rules to shorten all future speeches. Garson didn't just accept her award. She rewired the entire system. But beneath the fanfare, something subtler was taking root. Garson's image, calm, proper, endlessly virtuous, was beginning to harden into something less flexible. The very qualities that made her a wartime icon began to limit what roles she could play. She wasn't allowed to be messy, or flawed, or unpredictable. She was the Duchess, the Tower of Grace, the cinematic cathedral, and like all monuments, she became easier to admire than to engage with. Her subsequent films leaned heavily into this persona: Madame Curie, Blossoms in the Dust, Mrs. Parkington. Each performance polished the image a little more. Each script built her pedestal a little higher. By 1945, she had been nominated for Best Actress 5 years in a row, a record she would share only with Bette Davis. But here's the paradox. Success had become a kind of trap. Audiences loved her, but expected her to remain unchanged. Studios adored her, but couldn't imagine her doing anything modern. And Garson, ever the professional, complied until the world changed around her. The war ended. The appetite for noble sacrifice and sturdy womanhood waned. Film noir was rising. The anti-hero had arrived. And Garson, elegant, gentle, principled, no longer fit the story. But perhaps the most poignant thing about this chapter of her life is that it worked. She became, for a time, the most celebrated woman in Hollywood. Not by scandal, not by seduction, but by refusing to lower her voice. And yet, that same refusal, that dignity, would later be held against her. As we'll see in the next part, the tide turns quickly. The very system that held her up began to pull her down slowly. Then all at once, The films falter. The press starts whispering. The young husband gets louder. And Greer Garson, who once stood unshaken in the middle of a war, finds herself battered by something quieter, more cruel, and infinitely harder to fight: irrelevance. For a woman who built her career on calm composure. What happened next in Greer Garson's life looked like the unraveling of a perfect tapestry, slow at first, then chaotic, and, finally, impossible to hide. The very image of strength that had sustained her stardom was about to collide with something far more personal, and far less scripted: a marriage gone toxic, a body in pain, and a public beginning to turn. We left off with Garson at the absolute height of her fame, beloved, decorated, and seen as the embodiment of wartime womanhood. She was the cinematic North Star for a generation, holding steady through blitzes and heartaches on screen. But life behind the spotlight was fraying. In 1943, just a year after her Oscar triumph, Garson married a man nearly 12 years her junior, Richard Ney, a fresh-faced actor who had played her son in Mrs. Miniver. That detail alone raised eyebrows. The tabloids feasted on the pairing, whispering about their mother-son romance, and whether it was simply a post-Oscar infatuation. MGM's executives were livid. Louis B. Mayer reportedly urged her to delay any public announcement, fearing the optics might alienate fans or worse, draw mockery. But Garson was no stranger to controlling systems, and she didn't appreciate interference in her private life. She married Ney anyway, in a quiet ceremony, and offered a strikingly honest explanation to the press: "He makes me feel younger." It was an unusually vulnerable admission from someone so carefully curated by studio publicity. But that vulnerability soon became more than a headline. It became a reality she couldn't control. Ney, though handsome and charming in his own right, was not on equal footing with Garson professionally. He struggled to find serious roles, always existing in the shadow of his wife's fame. While she was being honored by presidents and queens, Ney was being introduced as Mr. Greer Garson. That kind of imbalance, especially in mid-century masculinity, was a recipe for resentment, and it began to show. Behind the closed doors of their home, and often, even behind the doors of her studio dressing room, Ney's frustration curdled into cruelty. Reports surfaced of his jealous outbursts, his mocking tone, his dismissal of her entire career as passé. He reportedly referred to her face, as a washed-up has-been. But Greer endured it. For a while, she was, after all, the woman who had survived a brutal spinal injury in her 20s, who had spent years climbing from regional theater obscurity to the heights of MGM stardom. Pain didn't scare her. Silence didn't defeat her. But betrayal, personal, intimate betrayal, was different. And then came the wave. In 1946, while filming Desire Me on location along the rugged California coast, Garson was struck by a rogue wave. The tide slammed her against the rocks, reigniting the spinal injury she'd suffered years earlier. She was dragged underwater, battered, nearly drowned. A local fisherman pulled her out, but the damage was done. She was hospitalized, in severe pain, and her recovery would take months. Production was chaotic. Directors walked off set. The male lead, Robert Mitchum, reportedly despised her, mocking her for being fussy and claiming she needed 125 takes just to say a single word. It wasn't true, but the narrative stuck. By the time she returned to work, bruised and anxious, her marriage had reached a boiling point. One night, shortly after Christmas, she closed the door to her dressing room for a moment of peace, not to shut Ney out, but to breathe. He didn't knock. He kicked it in front of onlookers. He stormed into the room and unleashed a tirade: accusations, insults, a man unraveling in the face of his wife's strength. It wasn't just abusive. It was symbolic. The door, like so much else in Garson's life, was no longer a barrier strong enough to hold back the chaos. She filed for divorce shortly after. In court, she held herself together until she was asked to recount that night the violence, the humiliation, the names he called her. Her composure finally cracked. She cried, and for the first time in years, the public saw her not as Mrs. Miniver or Madame Curie, but as a woman who had been hurt, humiliated, and left to pick up the pieces. The press, ever hungry for contrast, ran with it. Mrs. Miniver's heartbreak. One headline read. Another simply printed a photo of the courtroom. Beneath the caption, "The Duchess weeps." But what's worth noting, and what Tragedy Uncovered always seeks to highlight, is what happened after the tears. Hollywood turned its back. The roles stopped coming. MGM, now under new leadership, no longer saw Garson as an asset. The war was over, and the studio wanted fresh faces. New stories. Her type dignified, self-possessed, unconventionally sexy no longer fit the post-war palette of bombshells and bad girls. She tried to adapt. She starred in comedies. She played Irish maids. She even revisited Mrs. Miniver in a lesser sequel that audiences politely ignored. But the truth was clear. The world had moved on. The very qualities that once made her indispensable, her steadiness, her restraint, her moral backbone, were now labeled outdated, even dull. And unlike male stars who aged into gravitas and patriarchal authority, Garson was not given the same latitude. She was still luminous, still talented, but she was no longer wanted. And here lies the uncomfortable truth. Her fall was not caused by scandal or mediocrity. It was caused by a cultural shift in which womanhood, once celebrated for its strength, was suddenly required to be small again. The war was over. The soldiers came home. And the women who had held it all together in factories, in families, and yes, on screen, were expected to step aside. What happens when a woman no longer fits the story she helped define? By the end of the 1940s, Greer Garson, once MGM's crown jewel, the personification of wartime nobility, was becoming a puzzle Hollywood didn't know how to solve. The studio system that had once celebrated her virtues now quietly shelved her scripts. New executives brought new tastes, and those tastes had no room for women who reminded audiences of sacrifice, composure, or moral depth. What sold now was sparkle, danger, and youth. Garson was 45. Those studio press releases still listed her as somewhere in her late 30s. On screen, she looked immaculate, aided by soft lighting, lenses with deliberate diffusion, and meticulous makeup that softened the reality of aging. But behind the shimmer, she could feel it. The shift. The way conversations in boardrooms no longer included her name. The way scripts arrived with less complexity and more concession. She'd already tried bending, shifting toward comedy, playing working-class characters with Irish brogues, even poking gentle fun at her own virtuous image. Films like Julia Misbehaves and The Valley of Decision offered glimpses of something looser, more playful. In The Valley of Decision, co-starring a young Gregory Peck, she played a humble, made a departure from the dignified upper-class roles that had once defined her. Peck later said Garson had untapped comedic timing and warmth that audiences never really got to see. But the box office didn't bite. The truth is, the public didn't seem to know what to do with Garson once she stepped off her pedestal. She had spent a decade being revered. Now that she wanted to be something else, wittier, warmer, even a little messy, audiences simply turned to others. It wasn't that she lost her talent. It's that the system had moved the spotlight somewhere else, and no one told her how to follow it. What's most telling is how clean the erasure was. There was no grand scandal, no public downfall. Her image remained untarnished, and yet she was increasingly invisible. Her contract with MGM, which had once been the envy of aspiring actresses worldwide, quietly expired in 1954. The studio simply didn't renew. No headlines. No send-off. And just like that, the studio she helped carry through the war years walked away. Meanwhile, the women who replaced her weren't necessarily better, just different. They were younger, louder, less restrained. The industry had pivoted from matriarchs to ingenues, from heroines to heartthrobs. A new era was unfolding. Marilyn Monroe, Ava Gardner, Elizabeth Taylor, women with edge, allure, and a willingness to weaponize their sexuality on screen. Garson was not built for that world. Not because she lacked beauty, she didn't. Not because she couldn't act, she absolutely could. But because she represented a style of womanhood that no longer served the cultural mood. Post-war America was rebuilding its identity. And that identity had little interest in the kind of steely, noble femininity Garson embodied. The new woman on screen was either scandalous or ornamental, rarely both. The audience wanted seduction, not steadfastness. In that way, Garson wasn't just left behind by Hollywood, she was left behind by history. It's worth asking, why is dignity treated as disposable the moment it's no longer fashionable? Why does an actress who carried an entire studio's image through wartime become a relic just a few years later? The answer isn't only in the audience. It's in the machine. Studios are built to manufacture desire, not to honor legacy. Once an actor no longer generates fantasy, they're often recast literally and figuratively. And for women, that shift happens earlier, faster, and with far less mercy. Garson found herself at the center of that machinery, watching it change around her. She had done everything right, been gracious, collaborative, tireless. She showed up for war bond tours, attended charity functions, and never threw tantrums on set. And still, she was quietly filed away. Her final attempt to reignite the spark came with the Miniver story in 1950, a direct sequel to her Oscar-winning triumph. It followed the character of Kay Miniver into the post-war years. But it lacked the urgency, the gravitas, and most importantly, the cultural moment that made the original resonate. Audiences had moved on. The sequel faded into the background, and Garson with it. There's a line, rarely spoken aloud but understood in show business. When you're at the top, there's only one direction left. For Garson, that descent was slow, but clear. By the time her contract ended, she wasn't defiant. She was simply done. But what the world didn't expect, and what makes this next chapter so compelling, is that Greer Garson didn't cling to Hollywood. She didn't scramble for roles beneath her dignity or appear on late-night television trying to prove she was still relevant. She walked away. She chose something almost radical for a woman in her position, a quiet, private life. In 1949, at a dinner party in Santa Fe, she met someone far removed from studio lights, a tall, affable Texas oil man named Buddy Fogelson. He wasn't a director, or a writer, or anyone looking to mold her. He was simply a man who loved horses, land, and freedom, and perhaps that's exactly what made him so magnetic. They married that same year, and suddenly, Greer Garson, the woman who once dined with Roosevelt and Churchill, was riding horses on a ranch in New Mexico, learning to mend fences and run cattle. It sounds like fiction, but it wasn't. She exchanged red carpets for real dirt. This transition wasn't forced. It wasn't a fall. It was a pivot. And maybe, just maybe, the most powerful choice she ever made. Because while Hollywood forgot her, she remembered who she was, a woman who built her own path before, and would do so again. It's not every day that a woman willingly steps off the stage while the world is still applauding, especially in Hollywood, where vanity is currency and presence is survival. But Greer Garson, perhaps more than any of her peers, understood something that eludes most stars. There's dignity in walking away before the world decides for you. We left off with her marriage to Buddy Fogelson, a wealthy Texas oil man, rancher, and someone completely uninterested in the pageantry of fame. Their meeting was accidental, their courtship understated, and their union unshakable. It was, by all accounts, the first relationship in Garson's life that required no performance. Married in 1949, Garson left behind the social theater of Beverly Hills and rerouted herself in the American Southwest. She and Buddy settled on a working ranch, Forked Lightning Ranch, a sprawling 13,000-acre property nestled along the Pecos River in New Mexico. It was not a glamorous retreat. It was a legitimate, fully operational cattle ranch. And Greer Garson, the same woman who once wore silk gloves to breakfast on studio lots, threw herself into the dirt. She wasn't playing cowboy. She was living it. She rode horses. She managed livestock. She wrote for trade publications like the Beef Breeder Gazette. This was no publicity stunt. It was reinvention, not as a brand, but as a person. And maybe that's what made it so radical. Because while her peers were fighting to stay visible, clinging to roles that insulted their intelligence, or chasing television gigs that mocked their legacy, Garson chose stillness. Not silence. Exactly. She still acted from time to time, but it was always on her terms. In 1958, she returned briefly to the stage, replacing Rosalind Russell on Broadway in Andy Mame. After more than 2 decades away from live theater, she stunned critics with her energy and charisma. Younger cast members were reportedly in awe of her poise. Peter Fonda, who played her nephew in the production, affectionately dubbed her Annie Greer. And yet, she didn't stay. She had nothing left to prove. Her last significant film role came in 1960's Sunrise at Campobello, in which she portrayed Eleanor Roosevelt. It was a performance marked by both restraint and warmth, qualities that had always defined her best work. The role earned her a Golden Globe and her final Academy Award nomination. But even then, the ceremony felt less like a comeback and more like a curtain call. After that, she faded from the public eye, but not from public service. If there's one through line in Garson's life, it's that she never treated her success as personal property. Instead, she used it as a platform to give back. Once settled in Texas with Buddy, she threw her energy into philanthropy with a kind of quiet ferocity. She donated millions to arts programs, medical centers, and educational institutions, never for attention, always for impact. In Dallas, she helped fund heart research. In Santa Fe, she built a state-of-the-art theater facility, the Greer Garson Theater Center, designed to train future generations in both stage and screen arts. And she did it all without press conferences or name-dropping. She believed, simply, that opportunity should be passed on. It's easy to admire someone when they're winning Oscars. It's harder and more meaningful to admire them when they've stepped into the margins, still giving, still building, long after the cameras have stopped rolling. What makes this phase of Garson's life so compelling isn't just that it was unexpected. It's that it was intentionally private. In an industry addicted to reinvention, she didn't rebrand. She simply resumed being herself, the girl who loved literature, the woman who once studied French poetry, the daughter who spent her summers running barefoot through Irish grasslands. There was always a grounded, cerebral, even spiritual quality to Garson that Hollywood could never quite flatten, and perhaps that's why she endured. There were, of course, tragedies. The fire that consumed her ranch house in the 1980s also destroyed her original 1942 Oscar. Watching it burn on television, helpless, Garson later described the moment with a kind of poetic detachment, not because it didn't hurt, but because she had already accepted that no object could define her worth. The Academy eventually sent her a replacement. But by then, the meaning had shifted. The statue no longer represented ambition or applause. It was memory, nothing more, nothing less. And then came the deepest loss of all. In 1987, her husband Buddy passed away. They had been together for nearly 4 decades, a rare feat in any marriage, let alone one forged in the glare of old Hollywood. Without him, Garson began to retreat further from public life. Her health declined. She underwent heart surgery, relied on a pacemaker, and endured the quiet frailty that so often follows extraordinary lives. But even then, she remained Greer. Those who visited her during her final years at Dallas Presbyterian Hospital, where she lived in a private suite, often commented on her radiant presence. Nurses adored her. Visitors felt seen. The melodic voice had softened, but not vanished. The laughter, crisp, unfiltered, still filled the room. There's something haunting about that image. The woman who once inspired entire nations, whose voice was broadcast to millions, now reading quietly by the window, content to be forgotten by the world she once ruled. And yet, she wasn't bitter. If anything, she seemed relieved, because Greer Garson had done what few in Hollywood ever manage. She left on her own terms. She traded fame for freedom, attention for authenticity, and in doing so, she became something far rarer than a star. She became whole. What does it say about a culture when one of its most celebrated women disappears, not in scandal, not in disgrace, but in silence? Greer Garson died in 1996 in a hospital wing that bore her name. Heart failure. Age 91. The news passed with a brief wave of obituaries, respectful, muted, nostalgic. There were tributes. Of course, old colleagues spoke of her grace. The Academy remembered her historic speech. A few vintage film lovers revisited Mrs. Miniver and posted grainy clips to television retrospectives. And then, the quiet returned. No outcry. No long documentary series. No major biopics. For a woman who once made Winston Churchill weep and Roosevelt pause, her final curtain seemed strangely private. But maybe that's the deeper tragedy here, not that Greer Garson faded, but that we let her. Her life challenges one of the central myths we like to tell ourselves about fame, that if you're important enough, you'll always be remembered. But memory doesn't work that way, and neither does Hollywood. The truth is, Garson's kind of fame wasn't built for legacy. It was built for utility. During World War II, she served a function: to embody strength, poise, and moral certainty at a time when the world was burning. She offered comfort in chaos. But once the war ended and audiences wanted something edgier, sexier, more cynical, she was no longer necessary. And that's the uncomfortable reality of many public women's legacies. They are celebrated only as long as their symbolism is useful. When they stop serving the story we want to tell, they're erased. Garson wasn't alone in this. Think of the other women elevated as wartime icons: Eleanor Roosevelt, Rosie the Riveter, even figures like Katharine Hepburn, whose public images walked the tightrope between strength and societal expectation. But the moment the cultural pendulum shifted, when strong women were no longer in vogue, those stories were carefully folded away. What's different about Garson, though, is that she never fought the erasure. She didn't campaign for a comeback. She didn't publish a scandalous memoir. She didn't beg the Academy for lifetime achievement awards. She simply let the curtain fall. But here's the question worth asking. Did we forget Greer Garson because we stopped caring about the kind of woman she represented? Or did we stop caring about that kind of woman because we forgot her? It's a distinction that matters. Because if you look at the state of modern storytelling, especially the roles offered to older women, it's hard not to notice a pattern. The same dignity, strength, and grace that once made someone like Garson a top-billed star are now traits given to supporting characters. Side notes: strong grandma types, moral anchors for someone else's chaos. We rarely build stories around women like Greer anymore. And when we do, they're often cautionary tales, not celebrations. So what exactly did Greer Garson leave behind? The answer isn't on the marquee. It's not in box office numbers or Instagram quotes. It's in something quieter, something harder to measure. She left behind an example of how to hold yourself together when everything around you is trying to unmake you. She showed that success doesn't have to come at the cost of that love can arrive late and still last. That legacy isn't always about visibility sometimes. It's about how you disappear. Garson chose to live her later years out of view not because she had nothing to say, but because she had said enough. And that's a kind of power we don't know how to process, especially in an era that tells us louder is better. Exposure equals worth. And staying relevant is a moral obligation. She refused that bargain. And in doing so, she taught us something deeply subversive, that you don't need to be seen to matter. Still, it's worth asking, what did we lose when we let her slip away? We lost the memory of a time when strength didn't need to scream, when women could be powerful without being punished for it, when a single performance could change how people saw an entire war, not through violence or spectacle, but through steady, stubborn compassion. We lost a model for aging with grace, for transitioning with intention, for stepping out of the spotlight, not because it burned out, but because it was never the point. And we lost a reminder that some of the most important stories aren't the loudest ones. Greer Garson's story isn't just a Hollywood tale. It's a mirror held up to the audience, the industry, and the culture that both built her and buried her. It asks us to reconsider what we value in our icons. Is it charisma, longevity, drama, or something deeper, something that doesn't flash, but lasts? Because at the end of the day, Garson wasn't forgotten because she failed. She was forgotten because she refused to fail loudly. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of legacy that deserves to be remembered most. So maybe the real question isn't why Greer Garson disappeared, maybe it's why we were so quick to let her. What does it say about us as a culture when we honor a woman for her strength, only to abandon her when she no longer entertains us? When we celebrate grace during chaos, but discard it in peace? When we claim to value dignity, but only if it's camera ready? Greer Garson never gave us scandal. She never gave us meltdown. She gave us resilience. She gave us thoughtfulness. She gave us performances that once moved world leaders, and then she quietly moved on. And perhaps that's what makes her story so haunting. Because if even someone like her can be forgotten, what hope do the rest of us have in a world that trades depth for noise? Or maybe, just maybe, that's the lesson. That real legacy isn't built by being remembered loudly, it's built by living meaningfully, even when no one's watching. Thank you for staying with us to the very end. And if this story made you pause even for a moment, don't forget to subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered, so you never miss a truth the world tried to bury.